Probando. Uno, dos, tres. Buenos días. Buenos días, buenos días. Sí, 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 sí. Ok, buenos días. Probando. Probando. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco, seis, siete, ocho. Sí. Bueno, sí. Probando. Uno, dos.
sleep last night. So today I'm pleased and honored to introduce you to the panel speaker, that is Paola Velasco Santos. She is a social anthropologist from Mexico City. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México and a master's degree in regional studies from the Instituto Mora. She is currently a researcher and a level 1 member of the National Researcher System. She teaches environmental anthropology, political ecology, anthropological theory, and methodology courses in the political and social science faculty and in the anthropology graduate program in UNAM. Paola Velasco is the author of a book called Ríos de Contradicción, Contaminación, Ecología Política y Sujetos Rurales en Nativitas Tlaxcala, winner of the 2018 Fray Bernardino Sagún Prize for Best Anthropological Research Book at the National Institute for Anthropology and History. And she's been working with fireflies from the social aspects for a long time. So welcome, Paola. We are very glad that you could come here.
Thank you, Ek. Sorry. Well, thank you very much. Of course, I want to thank the 2025 International Firefly Symposium for inviting me. I really want to thank the scientific committee, the local committee, everyone that has been involved in the organization of the event, particularly to Sistel. Of course, you have done a wonderful, amazing job organizing all this, and to the University of Tlaxcala for hosting the event, and of course, all of you for being here. Can you put my presentation, please? Mi presentación. So it is an honor being here, standing here in front of you, especially because, as some of you may know, and now that Ek presented me, I am a social anthropologist, and for years I had been studying rural people in central Mexico. I have studied land dispossessions. The next one, please. I have studied land dispossessions. I have wondered whether rurality is a category only related to agricultural activities, or if it entails a way of seeing and being in the world. The last decade, I have focused on following a river, the Rio Atoyac, the Atoyac River, the third most contaminated river in Mexico. And that is a lot to say because Mexico has most of its rivers heavily contaminated, unfortunately. So actually, this river runs in the southernmost part of Tlaxcala and meets with the Zahuapan, the river that you can see running near downtown Tlaxcala. I don't know if you have seen it, and then exits into the Pacific Ocean in the southern state of Guerrero. Next, please. The reason I have been following the Atoyac is because I have been interested in the configuration of complex social environmental entanglements and the new subjectivities produced by the articulation of an array of subjects and processes like the Atoyac River, toxic substances, water overexploitation, historical conditions of precarity, and health problems in Tlaxcala. This endeavor advanced ethnographic inquiries on the mutual production of society and nature, and how these entanglements are shaped by historically and spatially situated political economies and the local expression of capitalist relations. In short, I wanted to understand the different ways people have established relations with the river, changing themselves and the river in a never-ending process of world-making. So turns out, and this is going to be more relevant later in my talk, that the heart of the valley of Puebla Tlaxcala, a place for centuries dominated by water, which set the pace and rhythm of all of its inhabitants, human and non-human, used to be a very rich lacustrine ecosystem that hosted prosperous pre-Hispanic cities, Cacaxtla and Xochitecatl. I don't know if you had time to go there, or you're going to be able to go there later. And later Spanish enclaves, Indian congregations, and rich haciendas that produced mainly wheat and maize. and was considered the most fertile land in Tlaxcala. In the wake of the 20th century, the lakes were completely drained for the expansion of agricultural fields, and the lacustrine way of life was ended. 5 decades later, in the 1960s, the region experienced a dramatic transformation when big factories were built over hundreds of hectares of agricultural fields, but failed to employ agricultural workers dispossessed of those land. In fact, since the 1940s, people started migrating to Mexico City and multiplying their economic activities. Apart from the huge amount of water extracted by those factories, all these industries discharge their wastewater directly to municipal drains or water streams without any treatment, causing serious problems both from the number of toxic substances released and because of the multiple chemical reactions that can arise from the contact between the different substances found in the river. In the river flow. A few of the health problems found among the population that live near the river and that are deeply related to the pollution of the water and air are leukemia, thrombocytopenic purpura, different types of cancer, kidney disorders, congenital malformations, and most importantly, they have found genotoxic and teratogenic damage. So the transformation of the region has been dramatic and drastic. From being a lacustrine ecosystem, it became a buoyant agricultural valley and later the backyard of polluting industries, which has ended fertility, modified the ways of life of its inhabitants, changed the way in which they relate to the environment that surrounds them, deteriorated their health, and endangered their future. In fact, in this very place here, a few years ago, together with a multidisciplinary group and grassroots NGOs, we were discussing about the environmental devastation in the Atoyac River Basin. This is a river. So the unequivocally sociocultural, economic, and religious history of the valley is from start to finish related to water. But this relationship has shifted along the years. What supported life had become a source of illness and a brutal expression of capitalist inequalities. So after working with these different communities in the river, I wondered how these relationships changed in the upper part of the basin, precisely where the river as a trickle begins, in the state of Puebla, product of of glaciers flowing from the Iztaccíhuatl volcano. This is important in two ways. First, in 2018, while concentrated in finding all these processes and dynamics produced by and through water, I encountered fireflies. Yay, at last. By the way, sometime later, we learned it was Photinus palaciosis, thanks to Ishwari Gutierrez and Edwin Dominguez's work. Thank you for that, guys. I don't know where you are. Of course, I was hypnotized by the fireflies. An everlasting image was imprinted in my mind since then. The flight of hundreds of fireflies in the darkness, as well as the synchronization of their lights on the ground and in the air, felt like the world was breathing through them. Second, I knew that although pollution and toxic, what I was working on, were absent in this part of the river, I was witnessing the birth of a particular entanglement between water, trees, forests, people, particularly ejidatarios, tourism, prosperity promises, historic economic precarity, and conservation narratives, among others. At this moment, I wanted to understand the process of how fireflies had produced a particular assemblage enabled by tourism and conservation narratives, scientific and local knowledge, and how this assemblage was tensioned by the historical and material conditions of the local population. And this is what I want to share with you today. I took the long road, I'm sorry for all that information, because I don't know, maybe some of you were expecting my talk, because I am a social anthropologist, to be more related to the cultural meaning of fireflies or the native eco-friendly perspectives of fireflies in Mexico, but I'm not gonna talk about this today, boo. Maybe you're wondering why is that so. First, I wanted to give you a small glimpse of what I have studied and hopefully transmit the idea that I strongly believe that environmental problems cannot be addressed or thought about in isolation from social issues. And therefore, solutions to these problems must also be thought about in tandem, right, social and natural. Because as my dear friends from the Tlaxcalan NGO, Fray Julián Garcés, which I've been working with for more than a decade, they say there is no possible environmental justice without social justice, and the other way around. There's no social justice without environmental justice nowadays. Thus, I want to share with you a more complicated and at times contradictory human firefly relationship scenario that brings major challenges to the conservation of fireflies, their forests, and the humans that they live with. Although I have just studied disentanglement in Puebla, not in Tlaxcala, I draw from my 20-year ethnographic experience in central Mexico to make this argument. So to do that, I have divided the presentation in 4 parts. The first part I named the decentering humans and thinking through multi-species worlds, then neoliberal conservation. The third part is multi-layered dimensions of care, and then some final reflections. So decentering humans and thinking through multi-species world. The late Neil Smith, a geographer, wrote that the 20th century can be considered the nadir of a process that has been taking place for centuries, in which Western societies have favored or flattered themselves over their supposed autonomy from the natural world. This separation, initiated by Francis Bacon during the Renaissance, René Descartes, and was later solidified with the Enlightenment and the scientific method. Since then, a social world independent and distant from external nature has been operating in the material world. In 1641, Descartes distinguished between res cogitans and res extensa, Latin words for describing a world made up of quote unquote thinking things. That's res cogitans. That is humans, but not all humans, and extended things. That is nature and every other thing bound to its body, but not its mind. Indeed, women, people native to the recently encountered American continent in that time, peoples of color, and many others were considered part of nature, not part of society. Although separated, the relationship between the two realms was not neutral. Descartes manifested that society, meaning just some men in the Western world, must become, and I quote, the masters and possessors of nature. No wonder Jason Moore and Raj Patel wrote in their recent book, History of Capitalism in Seven Cheap Things, that the inventors of nature were philosophers as well as conquerors and profiteers. Because the view of the world and the separation of its entities did not remain as an idea. Through centuries, it actively shaped and modified our world. So the Cartesian revolution, as some call it, because of Descartes, became the driving force of colonialism because it made thinkable and doable the project of domination, of world domination. So nature separated from society became common sense. It became the modern Western ontology, one that privileges things over relationships, domination over collaboration. This has led many researchers, philosophers, anthropologists, geographers, to assume that behind our present environmental problems lies an ontological dispute that needs to be addressed to successfully start building other ways of being in the world. So in 1990, William Cronon asked, can our concern for the environment survive our realization that its authority flows as much from human values as from anything in nature that might ground those values? And if the answer to this last question is yes, as surely it must be, then how can a more self-critical understanding of what we mean by nature enhance our efforts to protect the environment in ways that are both sustainable and humane? So fireflies, our main concern in this room, are being threatened by climate change, deforestation, light pollution, and the supposed solutions that have been put in place for their conservation, that is, tourism. Therefore, the real solutions we must seek need to be comprehensive, complex, and full of sacrifice, especially from those whose status quo is sustained by these inequalities of the current economic, ecological, political system, and by the nature-society dichotomy. To achieve them, we must first view problems such as climate change or environmental degradation as historical, political, and sociocultural processes, as well as ecological. Second, we must reject the formulation of technological, technical, or economic solutions that generally obscure the underlying social or political elements of the problems. In this regard, David Harvey argues that all debates about the limits of nature, about sustainability, or about scarcity are fundamentally discussions about the preservation or not of a particular social order. Since the 1960s, efforts have been made to tackle this nature-culture dichotomy and human exceptionalism. I teach a whole semester on this topic, so I cannot go through all the paths taken in this respect, but posthumanism, whose main figures are Donna Haraway, Rossi Braidotti, Manuel de Landa, Deleuze, Guattari, Bruno Latour, and others, its general aim is to decenter the dominant anthropocentric perspective and building on relational perspectives like assemblages, entanglements, networks, rhizomes. I believe posthumanism works as a big epistemological umbrella or starting point for other approaches like the ontological turn in anthropology, which is concerned with identifying other ways of organizing and classifying the world in indigenous groups. Other example is the multi-species studies that seek to decenter the human being and focus on the multiple subjects and objects with which the world is socially and materially produced, as well as the constellations that are woven by these encounters. And also there is anti-speciesism and animalism that are involved in more direct political or legal action to transform human and animal relations. I work with the multi-species perspective as I understand that the world is the product of the encounter between humans and a multitude of species and objects, and all those involved in these entanglements are able to affect both the outcome of this interaction and the way in which it is articulated. My approach to these multi-species encounters is that these arrangements unfold under the influence of historically situated political, economic, and cultural forces. That is, all these relations are unequivocally embedded in power relations, economic processes, and situated histories, which means they're also affected by relations of class, gender, and race. With all this in mind, I pose two questions here. The first, what does it mean to care for the multi-species assemblages produced by fireflies in Mexico, considering that to a large extent, the majority of firefly populations are found in places that have been preserved by rural populations that have precarious material conditions of life and that have been neglected by governments for decades. The second is, who benefits today from the multi-species network produced by tourism and neoliberal conservation? So now we go to neoliberal conservation. Before trying to answer these questions, I would like to put forward the idea that as an anthropologist, I use and believe in situated knowledge and ethnographic data, which is not anecdotal data, as is often in a kind of derogatory way portrayed by some scientists. Situatedness draws attention on how knowledge is produced and how this production is influenced by material, cultural, and historical contexts. And the ethnographic method provides thick data that helps to better understand how big problems express in particular ways. So in that sense, the following discussion is focused in Mexico, but I believe it can be extended or generalized to other places in the world. So Mexico has a surface area of 1 million, around 1,900,000 square kilometers. More than 50% of that surface is social property. 50%, half of Mexican territory is owned by ejidatarios or communal land. So after the Mexican Revolution, the new Constitution of 1917 included one article, Article 27, which paved the way for a more just property regime in Mexico, as it enabled the state to end land grabbing and distribute land as social property, prioritizing social interests over individual ones. Thus, in Mexico, we have three forms of property: private, public, and social. Those are ejidos and communal lands. These are managed collectively through assemblies, and before 1992, they could not sell their land. So currently, there are almost 30,000 ejidos that own just over 80 million hectares, or 80% of the total of social property, and 24,000 communal lands with 17 million hectares. The number of people with agrarian rights, that is ejidos and communal land proprietors, totals around 5,500,000 people. That is 5 times the population of Tlaxcala. Those are the ejidal owners. This is relevant because, for example, 2/3 of the country's water resources and 70% of forests and biodiversity are within social property. So to my knowledge, there is no information if there is a correlation between fireflies population and social property in Mexico. That's work that needs to be done. But one first insight is a search our team did back in 2020, where we looked for firefly tourism sites in the web, and we found at least 57 sites that promoted their activities on the internet, and about half of them were managed forests under social property rights, either ejidos or communal lands, while the other half were under private ownership. We have not updated that information, but surely the number of sites must have grown. Most of the social property sites are beneficiaries of government programs such as payment for ecosystem and or hydrological services, yet this is only provides only around $15 per hectare per year, so that's not enough to live. So ejidatarios or comuneros have always been involved in multiple economic activities, both individually and collectively. As collectives, historically, they have complemented their income provided by the ejido or communal lands with other economic activities like logging, either legal or illegal or both, Christmas tree plantations, fruit and nut tree plantations, large-scale or small-scale livestock farming, forest nurseries, small-scale agriculture, trout farming, ecotourist parks, sand mines, and many others, and in very few cases, carbon credits and water bottling plants. It might sound like very profitable ventures, but once the profits are distributed among the number of ejidatarios or comuneros, the earnings are minimal. So an ejido, this is for you to know, can have between 100 and 300 members. It varies, and because agrarian authorities change every 3 years, in many cases, there is no follow-up on these enterprises or these collective economic activities. So most of the time, these investments are lost, and then they have to reinvest again in another new enterprise. And firefly tourism is a recent addition to all of these activities. Rural people, whether ejidatarios, comuneros, small farmers, or jornaleros in Mexico, have navigated largely in precarious conditions and social inequality conditions. the multiple transformations and demands of Mexico's political economic models. Based on their own desires and material possibilities, constrained by social economic structures, they have combined activities as diverse as agriculture, masonry, industry, or domestic work in nearby cities, to the sale of stolen goods, fuel theft, or the production of counterfeit clothing. So these are all the activities that they have been involved with. And tourism is not new. It is the main motor of a profound transformation that has led workers from productive activities to the what is called third sector or service sector. Mexico has a very long and problematic history with tourism. It is intimately related to processes of dispossession, enclosure, resource hoarding, pollution, injustice, and inequality. There is no time to discuss all this history, but maybe the Riviera Maya in Mexico and Barcelona in Spain are emblematic examples of the devastation trail of tourism now worsened by the so-called digital nomads. And we have had very recent examples of people already making massive gatherings to go against gentrification and all this stuff produced in the beginning by tourism and now digital nomads. So after the neoliberal shift in the 1970s and 80s in Mexico, tourism was fashioned as one possibility for conservation or environmental protection, thus added to a huge list of promises of development and modernization and to the survival activities of rural populations. In this sense, multi-species care has emerged as a relationship that legitimizes the commodification of nature and appears in diverse and sometimes contradictory ways. As we wrote in the article led by Sarah Lewis and other colleagues back in 2021, firefly tourism in Mexico began slowly, which is now home of, as we learned in the first day of the symposium, it is now home to 300 firefly species. It all started in Nanacamilpa, a rural town in the state of Tlaxcala. I'm sorry I couldn't attend yesterday. There were a few papers on this on Nanacamilpa. So where in 2012, a few residents set out to safeguard the forest and to promote firefly tourism, conservation, and research by certifying certain forest patches as voluntary protected natural areas, the ADVC, totaling 940 hectares. This area was later named Santuario de las Luciérnagas, or Firefly Sanctuary. In that same year, the Photinus palaciosi firefly was formally recognized as a new species endemic to Mexico thanks to the Lab Zaragoza in UNAM. So these two events combined to ignite a tourism boom in a region that for centuries had been subject to land degradation and stark social and economic disparities. Since then, firefly tourism has increased dramatically. So more than 15 years ago, contributing to the critique of commodification of nature, Ego and Brockington proposed the category of neoliberal conservation, referring to the processes of fragmentation, regulation, and control of nature under the idea that market logic can contribute to its protection. So frequently, this pairing of supposed economic development and conservation has been implemented under the banner of charismatic species. However, it has not achieved the result in which all the species involved, including the human groups and their environments, benefit, or not necessarily. This is due to the logic of accumulation that underpins neoliberal conservation, but also to the social context in which these projects are implemented. So in this process, rural dwellers reinvent their relationship with and their conception of the environment, but also their very way of life under the narrative of a return to nature, but governed by market logic. So due to the scarcity of alternative revenue sources, coupled with the limited firefly tourism season in rural Mexico, a lot of site operators often feel the need to add infrastructure and activities to attract and encourage tourists to spend more time and money at their site. So they construct small cabins, camping grounds, zip lines, quad bikes, ATV rentals and trails, and other amusements, with, of course, the expected impacts or negative impacts on those activities in the survival of the firefly species. So, related to this, I would like to mention another point regarding collaboration with scientists. I think it's absolutely necessary and absolutely great that alliances are being forged with local people interested in firefly tourism. However, what we have observed over the last 8 years is that some scientists are often unaware of the local power groups, interests, and frictions inside and outside the ejidos, communities, and interest groups formed around firefly tourism. What we have documented is that the ejidatarios, most of the time or sometimes, have had to accept unequal negotiations with local groups that organize themselves as local tourism agencies, and they either fail to comply or only partially comply with the distribution of profits to the ejidatarios. Of course, I'm not saying every tour operator or agency reproduces these practices, but the fact is that many have. And it is important for scientists who are establishing relations with communities or that want to do it to acknowledge the fact that this has been happening. So unknowingly and unintentionally, of course, supporting some of these groups that maintain extractive relationships with the people who have cared for that environment or that species from the beginning is, to say the least, counterproductive. So what I want to say is that I want to invite you to build alliances with anthropologists, sociologists, or any other social scientists who are immersed in these localities to gain a broader view of the local power relations and a clearer picture of the place before helping or trying to intervene. Another problem caused by tourism has to do with the role assigned to local people in neoliberal conservation processes in any other of their forms. There is a dominant perception that people have a flawed relationship with nature and or the market. So through scientific and or qualified civil society intervention, they try to convert them, as Michael Goldman has argued, into eco-rational subjects. Eco for economic, eco for ecological. In this sense, people are mentored and considered unfit to make decisions, as they cannot deviate from the guidelines imposed by either rationality, economic and ecological. For example, they can have tourism, but not massive. They can cut down their trees, following the rules of the government, but not continue extracting firewood or mushrooms for family consumption because the park doesn't permit it. They are, in short, excluded from decisions about their resources, excluded from profits, and excluded, again, from the promises of the trickle-down economy. So I believe in part, this answers the questions of who benefits from the protection of fireflies through tourism. So I want to turn to the meaning of care or caring for something in this scenario. Neoliberal firefly tourism cannot be seen in isolation from other forms of care in the forests of central Mexico, just as relations of care cannot be isolated from the political economic system. In other words, these relations are not outside, spatially or temporally, from the Capitalocene. To exemplify these different forms of care, I will describe one of the ejidos in Puebla I've been working in, San Rafael Ixtapalucan, that have firefly tourism. It's, I don't know where the, oh, this is the place. In San Rafael, you can find several ways of caring for non-human entities like water, forest, plants, animals, and the mountain, or as they call it, El Monte. Although the forest has a very long history of logging, people have managed to preserve some of its forest. This is partly related to the fact that the ejido lands border the Iztapopo National Park, that's here, and the fact that population has cared for these spaces. One of the ejido's main collective businesses is forestry, Since 1970, logging is controlled by the government. That is, forestry engineers tell them how many hectares of forest they can cut, which trees are left out. They organize all the logging and assign a price for the wood depending on the quality and species of the tree. So based on this, the ejidatarios have sought to plant certain tree species that grow fastest and that can be harvested for decades. So for decades, the ejidatarios have cared for trees such as the Montezuma pine and the hardwoods pine, which have timber potential and are recommended by these engineers, uncaring or neglecting other tree species that inhabit these forests. This form of care overlaps with tourism and with the ejidal water bottling plant, which from the perspective of the ejidatarios is a form of care. They believed that the water that ran through ravines in the forest was wasted. So they channeled it to a purifying water plant to sell bottled water. This form of care organizes and selects who can benefit from the water and who cannot, because by disciplining the water to flow into certain channels, some forest animals are neglected by depriving them of a source of drinking water or preserving humidity conditions on the soil. So also, they neglect or uncare most of the local population, including the ejidatarios themselves, as they have suffered for the past 8 years of tap water shortage. They only receive water 1 day a week in their houses. So firefly tourism, forestry, and the water bottling plant are what I call multi-species care formations, consisting of overlapping layers of relations of care and neglect that are configured under the logic of each cycle of accumulation. While care sanctions particular ways of organizing, classifying, and disciplining human and more than human bodies, this formation can coexist with others that might be considered contradictory, but which are largely explicable when articulated around the imperative of making a living or just simply surviving. So there are 3 main points I want to highlight about these issues of care. First, multi-species care formations are composed of historically situated and often contradictory layers, but which operate or friction in a very productive way. That is why a commercial logic of selling and bottling water can coexist without conflict with the narrative of firefly conservation, for example. Number 2, multi-species care formations, as feminist and other studies suggest, like the beautiful study of Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, do not necessarily respond to ethical or moral principles, but rather to daily struggles to earn a living, and to individual and collective desires that seek to fulfill the everlasting promises of development or modernization of each cycle of accumulation. And 3, multi-species care formations necessarily involve not only contradictory care, but also the neglect or lack of care for other species, as well as their concealment. That explains why these formations organize, classify, and discipline human and non-human bodies. Okay, so some final reflections. It is important to observe these multi-species care formations within a far-reaching historical and regional framework. These formations, whether related to the use of animals or to promote tourism, must be understood as intrinsically political. In this sense, thinking about care and uncare of certain human and non-human bodies is always a political act, since it presupposes the unequal distribution of care, that is, of resources and emotional involvement for certain entities, and therefore the neglect of others. The unequal distribution of care can manifest itself at the local level and does not necessarily respond to ethical or moral principles, but rather to daily struggles of making a living and to individual and collective desires within a regional or even national context. So capitalist relations contribute to weaving particular multi-species networks and historically specific subjects such that fireflies and humans mutually produce each other under neoliberal logic. In this process, fireflies, through the discourse of beauty, uniqueness, and connection to the natural pulse of the land, work to ensure that ejidatarios receive some benefits from tourism. The paradox is that these supposed benefits are ephemeral and based on an illusion, which is the pairing between sustainability and economic development. To obtain the benefits they really seek, they would have to maximize tourism, which would eventually, due to soil compaction by vehicles, water consumption, garbage emission, light pollution, end up diminishing or even eliminating the firefly population. Furthermore, based on what we have seen, it cannot provide a livelihood for all the inhabitants of one municipality, not even for all the members of a single ejido. So, just as fireflies synchronize at night to find mates, conservation efforts have synchronized with neoliberalism. Cooperation is key to their mating and survival as a species. Alas, the synchronization between conservation and capitalism has also been cooperative, and the result of the union between the two has been neoliberal conservation. So this has been positioned as a global narrative that, in general terms, posits that market logic and economic growth are the best and most viable option to save nature. And this is very dominant in international agencies, government institutions, and companies seeking to clean up their reputations. Paradoxically, it is precisely this economic logic that has produced climatic change and the social and environmental crisis we're facing. So there is a big gap between the rhetoric of tourism and reality. So we must therefore avoid falling into the discursive trap and consider the numerous studies that show that in neoliberal conservation, not everyone wins. On the contrary, including the species themselves, sometimes lose. So tourism, at least as configured under capitalism, perpetuates the idea of consuming nature, the idea that produced this crisis in the first place. As it is, neoliberal tourism perpetuates the exploitation of both human and non-human actors and perpetuates unequal relations, dispossessions, and displacements. So in the Mexican case, I consider that it is tremendously unfair that the poorest and most marginalized people, who are those who have maintained these ecosystems and species, are imposed the great responsibility of sacrificing even more and solving the social environmental problems caused by a system that has made them double losers. On the other hand, the solution is not the exclusion of the social to save nature. That is to say, people should not be considered the enemy in any sense. The enclosure of land and expulsion of people out of environmental protection areas is not the solution either. Precisely because it is those people who have historically inhabited these spaces who, through their multi-layered relationships of care, managed to preserve the habitat of fireflies. It is the material conditions that the historical organization of the world and the entities that compose it under the nature-society dichotomy and the insatiable search for accumulation under capitalism that must be eliminated. So now, before I finish, let me make something very clear. I have no doubt that there are successful cases of firefly ecotourism. In fact, we hosted a whole workshop on Monday during where many of these projects were discussed and praised. In addition to the fact that we have in this room, we have very committed people, scientists, communities, tour operators, and enthusiasts. So tourism is an undeniable reality, and it is something that we must tackle and try to make the best of it. But the reflection I propose here is way deeper and confronts us with our way of thinking about the world and opens the possibility of thinking outside the neoliberal box or the capitalist box. So to conclude, we must look for alternatives that consider the social and the environmental as one. Social inequalities and problems like poverty and marginalization must be addressed to begin imagining just multi-species relationships. It is time to work in collaboration and understand that there is no possibility of environmental justice without social justice. They go hand in hand. So if we keep thinking that nature, animals, plants, fungi are outside the networks of social relationship with which we build the world, and ignoring that they are traversed by a capitalist Cartesian logic, we will not be able to imagine, much less materialize, a just and sustainable future for all of us who inhabit this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola, for very inspiring and challenging. Who wants to ask questions? No questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, bueno, lo voy a decir en español porque siento que, no sé, así es más fácil para mí. Para empezar, le quiero felicitar mucho por su presentación. Me inspiró mucho y muchas gracias bueno, es que siento que es algo que damos como por sentado, o sea, más bien como que no lo vemos, el ver más allá de solamente las especies y me inspira mucho su presentación. Y le quería preguntar, ahora sí que en el contexto de también todas las presentaciones que hemos visto durante todo este simposio, a mí me interesaba, porque como persona de México, pues entiendo el contexto mexicano, pero cuando lo extrapolamos a contextos más capitalistas, más neoliberalistas, que ya es algo, pues ahora sí que voraz, digámoslo así, se pierde mucho esta como conexión con lo natural, incluso con las mismas personas, o sea, ya, por lo menos como yo lo veo, por lo menos como en la parte de los ejidatarios, ellos tienen que organizarse, ellos se comunican, pero en la parte de la propiedad privada, pues ya simplemente es como la decisión de una persona. Y, y por ejemplo, lo que quiero ahora sí como preguntar o como que se dialogue un poquito más es cómo podremos construir desde un punto, como este punto, pues súper, como súper capitalista, en donde no solamente las relaciones humano-naturaleza están como fragmentadas, sino las relaciones entre humanos también estamos fragmentados y cómo, pues creo que esa es la pregunta mayor, ¿no? ¿Cómo podemos conservar y preservar dentro de estos contextos tan urbanizados, ¿no? ¿Sí me da a entender?
Sí, well, voy a traducir tu pregunta. Muchas gracias. What you're saying is how can we begin to think in preserving nature inside capitalism? Yes? Well, I don't know. No, I mean that's what a lot of people has been trying to wonder. It's very difficult. That's why I talk about the neoliberal box or the capitalist box, because it's very difficult to think outside the box and to operate outside the box. That's why because it seems like well, I am criticizing neoliberal conservation and ecotourism, but it is something that we have to tackle, and we have to do it in the best way possible. And I think the first step is, as I said, to not just think of the firefly in this case. Okay, we have to think about the people that live with that firefly and that have, and not only with fireflies, and with the fungi that live in the forest, with the trees, with the other animals and plants that live there. So it is like and it is very difficult to do that because we are separated in disciplines and government agencies, and they all have different opinions. So that's why I think one first thing is stop thinking about this dichotomy, but also start collaborating. And for that, I thank Sarah Lewis for taking me in, Finn, quite some years ago. But I think it's this collaborative work, not only between scientists, but of course with communities, and start thinking in different ways. No, that we're not outside nature. So, and that everything affects us, and it is not an easy, because even it is a linguistic problem. We don't have other words. We still say nature and society. No, we don't have a word that talks about, well, there are some words, but like the web of life or things like that. But I think we have to do it one step at a time, because, as I said, this is an ontology that has been constructed for centuries and is very very difficult to get out of it. So, but one little step at a time. I think this is, now me being here, thank you for having me, is one little small step to start collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula, for your talk, and also to bring back to English, because it's nice that everybody can follow such kind of discussions. One point I want to make, I'm from Belgium, and in Europe, and there the situation is maybe a bit different than in Mexico. But I think most of the firefly people not only want to protect fireflies, they use the firefly as an umbrella species to try to protect habitats and natural places. So I think within our community, that's, I guess, the standard way of thinking. My question is, how can we, as firefly enthusiasts or firefly specialists or firefly researchers, what do you suggest? How can we be involved more in concrete in these kind of actions to actually help the local people to benefit really from fireflies and saving the habitats where the fireflies live and themselves?
Thank you. Yes, I think it's a very different, like social relations and history that in Europe, of course. For one part, but you also have that dichotomy, and I mean there is an ontological, way of thinking there. But I believe that one way of starting is reading about the history of these places, because sometimes this ecological problem, I mean, reading.
I'm talking, how can we help Mexican?
Oh,
yes.
Okay. Yes, reading social, I mean, reading about the history of those places, because that's what I was saying. Like, these people are, some of them are poor, some of them are not that poor, but they're not living in the best conditions, and this is like a country problem. So understanding how they got to that place, what happened for them to be in that situation. For example, the place I was working in, the San Rafael Ixtapaluca, has a very long history of being affected by a paper mill that was working since the 1800s, and it devastated that part of the mountains. But they learned a logic. I mean, they learned a way of relating to the forest that was produced by the mill. So in understanding that historical process, you can start to understand why ejidatarios take some decisions. Because if you arrive and say, okay, you have to preserve the firefly, and You have to stop doing this. They are not gonna you're not gonna be able to have a productive relation if you don't understand where they come from or how they think, or how have they historically been working with or within the forest. I don't know if I've made, no. Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
unfortunately, I'm sure there is a lot of discussion that can be done, but we have to finish.
Thank you.
So we thank you very much, Paola, for.
Thank you.
So the next part of the session will be back where we were yesterday. So if you can move there, yes. Thank you very much.
Muchas
Also,
gracias.
if someone lost a
Sí.
recording machine, we found a recording machine. I don't know. No one from here. Okay, it's there.
Sandra, nombre. Muchas